Greetings to you as we come to look at Hebrews chapter 8. As we've been going through Hebrews, we keep seeing how Jesus is presented as better. Better than the prophets, better than the angels, better than the priests, better than the high priests, better than the whole of the ancient Jewish religion. And we're going further with the betters today in a relatively short chapter. We'll see that Jesus is better because he offers us and he ministers in a better sanctuary. That's really important. That is the place of the offering to God, and a better tent. The sanctuary is the inner place of the tent or the tabernacle from the time of Moses. In the time of Solomon and the building of the great temple, the tabernacle is replaced by the temple, but still you've got the Holy of Holies, the most high place where the high priest goes to offer the sacrifice for the forgiveness of sin. And here Jesus is better. He's going to be better than the holy place, better than the temple or what preceded it, the tabernacle, the tent. In fact, better in every way than those things, and we'll see that. But that's summarized halfway through this chapter 8 by Jesus presenting a better covenant, what we call a new covenant or New Testament. But it's important that it's better than the old one. Now, the covenant summarized and included all the elements we've seen up to now. The prophetic ministry and the priestly ministry and the sacrificial ministry and all that is part of God's covenant with his people. And that covenant in Jesus becomes obsolete. Obsolete's a strong word, but it's what we have in this chapter as it's replaced by a better covenant. And that says a great deal about human religion, because again and again, religion in our world and since the time of Jesus has tended to slip back into the old types of covenant, which were often very people-centered. They depended on people doing things. And the new covenant is utterly Jesus-centered and depends only on him. And we must not slip back into the old from the much better new. That's just an introduction. Chapter 8 is relatively short, so I'm going to read it in two parts. First, verses 1 to 6. Now, the main point in what we're saying is this. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary and the true tent that the Lord and not any mortal has set up. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Hence it's necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They offer worship in a sanctuary that is a sketch and shadow of the heavenly one. For Moses, when he was about to erect the tent, was warned, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." But Jesus has now obtained a more excellent ministry, and to that degree, he is the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted through better promises. He starts off reminding us of the great high priest. We have such a great high priest. That is one who can minister to our needs because as a human being subject to weakness and frailty, but also a Son made perfect forever. We have a high priest who is the Son of God, who can sympathize with us, but whose priestly offerings and sacrifices in the singular, in Jesus' case, his offering, his sacrifice is perfect for all time and doesn't need to be repeated. We have such a high priest, in effect better than the high priests of the Jewish religious system up to that day. Our high priest, verse 1, is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. Seated are two important implications in that. Seated at the right hand of the throne means that he shares the power and the dignity of the throne. In fact, he is more than a priest, he is a king. He is a priest and king. And if you go back to chapter 1, he's a prophet as well. The whole thing, the prophet, priest, and king, all of God's promises fulfilled in Jesus. He's being seated at the right hand of God, or literally having sat down at the right hand of God, shows that he's king. But it also shows that his priestly act, his sacrifice, his offering is completed. Because it was very strongly emphasized in the Old Testament rules for the priest that in ministering in the sanctuary, the priest stood, and the priest stood for hours on end sometimes. There was actually a little room hidden away, according to Jewish writings, where the priests, after ministering, could sit down and rest, because they had to stand for their ministry. But Jesus is sat down. He has completed his ministry. And there's a picture there of rest as well, um, hidden away in that meaning of having sat down. But we'll come to more of that as far as we're concerned. He's a king and he's a priest, and his work as priest is complete, or at least his work in offering the sacrifice is complete. He continues in priestly mode in interceding for his people, and he is able to do that sitting down because the offering is complete. Not only is he a priest who is also a king, back to Melchizedek, but better than the Old Testament priests, but he's also minister in a sanctuary and the true tent or tabernacle or temple that the Lord and not any mortal has set up. That is, the whole provision of the way of salvation is entirely God's doing. The tabernacle was set up by Moses according to God's instructions, but it was the work of a human being. And God graciously allowed Solomon to improve on the tabernacle by building the temple, also the work of human beings. And the sacrifices, of course, were offered by priests in the tabernacle and in the temple. And although they were offered to God, and this was the way God asked for it, set it up at that time, it was human doing. Man humanly erected tabernacle and temple, and human priests offering and re-offering and repeating the offering, because it was never complete or perfect, but it was a start, it was something, but it was all man-made. Not to say wrong, it was man-made according to God's instructions, but as we'll see, that wasn't good enough. There was fault. We'll see how that works. Jesus ministered in the sanctuary and true tent that the Lord and not any mortal had set up. The Lord, slightly interesting if you want the technicality, whenever Hebrews refers to the Lord, apart from occasional Old Testament quotes, the Lord is Jesus. Jesus set up the true tent in which he offers the true sacrifice. It's all about Jesus. Our salvation comes from Jesus and depends on Jesus and does not involve any purely human intermediary. It's Jesus. Verse 3, for every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices, hence it's necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Well, we know and we see, and we'll see more in later chapters what it is that Jesus offers. But of course, it's himself, his death, his blood, all that he is, he offers. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They offer worship in a sanctuary that's a sketch and shadow of the heavenly one. For Moses, when he was about to erect the tent, was warned, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. God, back in Exodus, had given Moses details for erecting the tabernacle. But that is now presented as a sketch and shadow of the heavenly one. We have to be careful about this. The heavenly tabernacle, temple in which Jesus is offering sacrifices, what does that mean? Now, it's very easy, and a lot of people and a lot of philosophy and some theology has been tempted to say, well, earthly things aren't real, only heavenly things are real, and try and make a distinction of what's called technically Platonic philosophy from the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, who says that things you can touch and feel aren't the reality. The reality is an invisible truth that's out there, and what we can touch and feel and see isn't the real thing. It's a shadow of the real thing, and the real thing is out there. That's not what this is saying. The Bible is not saying that the flesh, the body, what we can touch and see and feel and taste isn't real. It absolutely is real. We believe that Jesus became flesh for us, and we believe that he rose from the dead, flesh and bones and all, as the Church of England prayer book puts it very correctly. The reality of the physical body is real, and the reality of the heavenly resurrection body is real and physical. The distinction here isn't between physical and spiritual in that sense, in the Platonic sense that what's here isn't real. This isn't a lesson in geography. It isn't saying here on earth it's just shadowlands and there in heaven a different place. It's real. What he's talking about isn't the geography of the sacrifice or the tabernacle. What he's talking about is the spirituality or the reality in a different sense. It's not where, it's what nature. What is the essence of this? The essence of the Old Testament tabernacle is that God gave Moses a sketch plan, a blueprint, make a tabernacle this way. It was man-made. It was according to God's plan, but there were defects in it, which we'll see as we come in more to the second half of the chapter. Jesus made his offering on the cross. Real, real place, real nails through real flesh, real blood shed. It's not a spiritual reality of sacrifice that's somewhere out of this world. It's not, as one or two of the very early theologians said, and were deemed to be wrong in their own day, but they argued strongly that Jesus continues to offer a sacrifice in heaven that's invisible and not corporeal, not bodily. Jesus' offering was made on this earth, if you want the geography, real, in the city of Jerusalem, or in what's now in the city, but on the cross, which was just outside the city, but Jerusalem. And Jesus' offering was made in real space and real time and real human geography. And this, to say that the sanctuary that Jesus made that was different from the sanctuary that Moses made was outside geography, it just turns our religion into one that isn't real, isn't actually connected with who we are. Of course, we're spirit, but we're flesh and bones and blood and all the rest of it. And that's where and how Jesus made the sacrifice. But the reality of the sacrifice and the reality of how he made it was quite different. He provided the place, he provided the way, not according to Moses' sketch, but according to a much better plan. It was on earth geographically, but it was heavenly or spiritual in its eternal significance. It was an eternal act performed on earth. Now, stuff we do on earth isn't eternal. It dissolves, it disappears, as do our bodies and as do we on earth. What Jesus is doing is linking heaven and earth, as he does, of course, with his incarnation, as he does with his resurrection and ascension. And here on the cross, he links heaven and earth. He does on earth, in our geography and in our history, an act which belongs to eternity, which belongs to the heavens, which has significance and reality beyond this earth and beyond what we understand as time, beyond what we see as this creation. The reality of what Jesus does is eternal and heavenly. And that is different, but it's not unearthly. It's a real sacrifice, real suffering, real flesh, real blood, a real cross, a real date, and a real place in our world, but utterly significant because it's also part of eternity and part of heaven. We sometimes talk about heaven and earth being joined in what happened in the stable when Jesus was born, or in the incarnation, if you see it, at the time that the angel came to Mary and she conceived. We see heaven and earth being joined in some way in the resurrection and the ascension. Let's see here that heaven and earth are joined in the cross. And that is a better ministry. Jesus has obtained a better, more excellent ministry. Verse 6. And to that degree, he's the mediator of a better covenant enacted through better promises. Why do we need a better covenant and better promises? Verse 7, let me read 7 to the end. And most of it is a quotation from Jeremiah 31. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no need to look for a second one. God finds fault with them when he says, "The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their ancestors on the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I had no concern for them, says the Lord. This is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach one another or say to each other, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful towards their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. In speaking of a new covenant, he's made the first one obsolete. What is obsolete and growing old will soon disappear. People have different understandings of it will soon disappear. I take it to mean that this is written before the temple was destroyed, when temple sacrifices were still happening, but not long before. Soon after, the temple was destroyed, and the old covenant that was based on sacrifices in the temple disappeared, because there have been no sacrifices in the temple for nearly 2,000 years, since 70 AD. The old covenant that depended on tabernacle or temple and humanly performed repeated sacrifices is no more. The old type of priesthood, the old assumptions of access to God through a priest, gone. And there was fault with the old covenant. Well, technically, the fault was with the people with whom the covenant was made. If that covenant had been faultless, verse 7, there would have been no need for a second one. Verse 8, God finds fault with them when he says, and then he quotes this passage from Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34. It's the longest Old Testament quotation in the New Testament. It's important. He doesn't argue from Jeremiah the way we might. The New Testament has a very distinctive way of approaching and using the Old, which we ought and need to learn from. What was wrong with the Old Covenant was that the people broke it. Verse 9, not like the covenant I made with their ancestors, etc., for they did not continue in my covenant. One thing that was wrong was that they broke it, they disobeyed it. The covenant incorporated the law. The covenant incorporated so much. The covenant incorporated the Sabbath as a picture of rest. The covenant incorporated the priesthood and their sacrifices and everything, and it depended on human obedience. And in that sense, it was faulty. Also, I think we can argue, you take me to task on this one, but I think it's important, and it's expanded as we come into chapters 9 and 10 and 11. The Old Covenant was in the time of Moses, and Moses was the great leader who led the people into the covenant relationship with God, as God taught him to. But that was secondary to the first covenant, the great covenant that God made, which was the covenant with Abraham. Because the covenant with Abraham was that the whole earth would be blessed. The covenant with Moses was setting up a people of God, a nation, through whom the earth would be blessed. But the nation strayed, the people of Israel in the days of the Old Testament, strayed away from the covenant, continually. And any concept that the purpose of the covenant was to bless the nations was lost quite soon. David had that covenant and that concept, and Solomon did, and we see the nations being blessed, the whole world beginning to be blessed through David and Solomon. But as the kingdom fell apart, and one king and another, and one generation and another sinned and turned away and made idols and failed to worship and honor God, they weren't even being blessed themselves, never mind blessing the world. So the covenant is a lesser one than what we might call the Abrahamic covenant, which we'll get back to. But it's the Abrahamic covenant which Jesus is renewing, and the covenant through Moses, the Mosaic covenant, which Jesus is replacing. One of the problems with the covenant through Moses was that the people didn't obey it all the time. That's pretty bad. The other covenant is that it didn't finally fully deal with sins. Part of the purpose, or the purpose, of sacrifice and the sacrificial system and the temple was a focus of prayer, people turning to God, but it was also about people's sins being forgiven. But the sacrifices that the priests performed in order to forgive sins didn't forgive sins. They had to be repeated. They were only a symbol of the forgiveness of sin. They were only partial at best. They could only also, in the Old Testament Moses covenant, deal with deliberate sins, not or with that they could deal with accidental sins or sins of ignorance, but deliberate acts of rebellion against God couldn't be dealt with in the Old Covenant. Of course, in Jesus, they can and they are. And so at the end of this quotation from Jeremiah, which we're not going to spend all the time on, it's worth many talks of its own. But just note towards the end in verse 12, for I will be merciful towards their iniquities. Iniquities is depth, deep sin. And I will remember their sins no more. This new covenant, this better covenant, this covenant through Jesus deals with sin. One sacrifice on the cross deals with sin for all time and for all eternity. And it deals with all sin, deliberate sin, accidental sin, ignorant sin. I will be merciful towards their iniquities. Iniquities is deliberate wickednesses, and I will remember their sins no more. That's the new covenant. That's what Jesus achieved in replacing the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the laws and rules and sacrifices and sacrificial system and priesthood and everything else of the Old Testament. Jesus replaces it. It's obsolete. Don't fall back into worship that depends on human beings in some way to bring you peace with God. Through Jesus alone, we will find peace with God. Through Jesus alone, true Sabbath rest. Through Jesus alone, the forgiveness of sins. Much more continued next time. God bless.